You strong.
One surprise after another made the two girls freeze in place. It took a while for me to regain my composure when I shouted and asked if he had just stabbed it with a wand, and what about magic? However, using it to defeat a pig monster, a pig that had turned into a monster, was not easy at all. The only reason this was possible was because he used mana unconsciously. Although he was still far from his aura state, he had begun to adapt to being able to survive on his own. Then the three of them quickly gathered around to see the pig monster's situation. Nilia pulled out the wand from its mouth and gave it to him after confirming that she informed Li Han that he had defeated it. Yoner was still scared. Her legs were so weak she couldn't stand up. She sighed. Did the subject need to be so harsh? It's unbelievable that they could throw first-year students into a place like this. Li Han reached out to help Yoner up when they heard a familiar growl from a pig monster. Making their faces as black as the bottom of a pot, it probably wasn't that unlucky, but they just had a hard time taking down one of them. He was depressed but still had to confirm with his friends. It seemed like there was one more. Yes, Yoner was still panicking and was about to leave this class, but Nilia stopped her and advised her not to do so. It seemed like this monster was very close to them, so the sound was quite clear. Thanks to that, the black demon girl was able to follow and move towards the source of that sound. She raised her hand to signal to her two friends, so she should stand behind and she should go ahead and investigate. Following that direction, she saw a pig monster facing head-on with a few students below. Li Han looked far away to see the situation and saw that there were so many people in their group that they probably wouldn't have any problems taking down monsters, so the three of them could just sit and watch. The black demon friend listened to what he said, seemed convincing and immediately agreed. Suddenly, in that group of people, a brave person stood up and said he wanted to take care of defeating the monster. It seemed that he also intended to use the enlarged wand as a weapon, and this boy was Ashan Dalkard. Yoner wiped the sweat from her forehead and suspiciously recognized him as Ashan from the Dalkad family. Dalkad is a family famous for its excellence and extremely precise work. The Wardanas family has assisted the emperor as advisors for many generations, and the Dalkad family has assisted the emperor as praetor and treasurer. Li Han thought that if this was Dalkad, he could be trustworthy, because looking at his standing posture, it looked like he had learned swordsmanship. Ashan pushed his glasses and confidently said he could 100% see the pig's movements. He thought that the monster would never escape his calculations. At that moment, it also ran in front of him and growled viciously, looking at him with cold eyes. With confidence in his ability to judge, he quickly rushed up and hit this monster with a stick. But not only was it not defeated, it also became angrier and crazier. It glared at him while he was still standing there stupidly, not believing that his calculations were wrong, so he didn't bother. Pay attention to that scary look. Just like that, the ferocious pig monster rushed towards him, knocking him unconscious and lying on the ground, looking pathetic. Next, it rushed towards the two female students of the group, intending to attack them, making them extremely frightened. They were so scared that they were about to burst into tears when suddenly there was a hand in front of them. It was Her Highness Adenard who wanted to protect the two of them from that ferocious pig monster. Seeing that Nilia had finally come out, Yoner asked him what their group should do next. But he just quietly focused on observing and calculating. The ferocious pig monster is gradually approaching Her Royal Highness. Her eyes gradually became determined and she reminded herself to be perfect, just like she always does. She rushed up strongly and ran straight towards it, paying close attention to how it moved and attacked to receive the most accurate attack. But to her surprise, as soon as she ran closer, the griffin was attacked from behind, causing it to roar in pain. A blinding light emitted, causing the princess to narrow her eyes in surprise at the scene before her eyes. That monster was defeated with just one blow and fell to the ground. Li Han now breathed a sigh of relief. Luckily he wasn't caught red-handed. Nilia then asked him if he knew how important it was to approach it from the opposite direction. He felt that it was very useful advice, so he asked her to give more valuable experiences like that in the future. When the princess saw that he was the one who defeated the monster, she was really surprised and grateful. So she approached to thank him, but he quickly waved his hand politely and said, "It's nothing, Your Highness the Princess." Nilia, standing next to her, couldn't help but wonder why the two of them were so stubborn. Wasn't there a rule that schoolmates had to quit doing that? Yoner was at a loss. Because of her gratitude for Li Han's life-saving grace, the princess promised to repay him. When he heard her say that, he immediately wanted to ask her for something. Although His Highness on the outside calmly told him to keep talking, inside his mind he was nervous and worried about what he would ask for. He was a little confused and shyly said, wanting her to help him suggest some subjects that would be easy to get high scores because he knew she had a lot of relationships with other people. After hearing his wish, Her Highness Adenart couldn't help but be surprised because she thought he must be very demanding and only wanted her to suggest a few subjects that were easy to get high scores. She kept thinking for a while. She wondered what he meant. Was he really just asking which subjects could easily get a high score, or was he just testing her? Li Han still enthusiastically asked her if she knew any such subjects, and she said, a little confused, to be honest. Before the princess could answer, a voice rang out, saying she knew what lesson Li Han was looking for and knew better than anyone. Hearing that, he suddenly felt that this was a bad feeling. It was the trembling feeling he had felt before whenever a university professor patted his shoulder. This atmosphere is really similar to that time. He wondered doubtfully, this is it, when a person approached and called his full name Wardanas. It turned out that person was Professor Uregilm. He came forward and placed his hand on his shoulder and said, that's alchemy. The feeling when he approached was exactly like when he met the university professor in his previous life, really, stuffy and stuffy. Seeing that his emotions were unstable, he told himself to calm down. Now I am no longer the scared, immature student like before. He calmly told the professor that it would be a good subject if he had enough passion and love for it. Li Han thought this was a perfect answer to refuse the professor's invitation and looked very pleased, but Professor Uregilm slowly said that's what he thought. He emphasized that he should listen carefully. He would create that passion and love for him, causing him to hastily refuse the professor, saying that he was not ready to study that subject. The other students around were whispering and talking, as expected of the Wardanas family, and the professor wanted to pull him back, but he really didn't want to do that. How could they be jealous, just because of this? Professor Uregilm heard him refuse so bluntly and sighed helplessly. Then he turned to caress the pig monster that Li Han defeated. He thought that today's lesson was enough. Hearing that, he also thought that the professor had finally let him go, so he breathed a sigh of relief. The professor also felt a bit regretful that the other group of creatures had not yet encountered the students. Upon hearing that, Ashan suddenly understood that the professor intentionally led them to the group of first-year students. This sentence of his made the professor laugh out loud. He couldn't believe that this group of first-year students thought he said they only went to the forest to pick herbs. How could they be so naive? He reaffirmed that today's goal was for them to face different situations in the forest while searching for herbs. Whether they catch it, avoid it, run or hide from it, an alchemist needs to have the skills to deal with unexpected situations. After that, the professor didn't forget to sarcastically mock them as a group of ironheads, causing the first-year students to listen and only dare to secretly scold him for being bad people, but they were so angry that they couldn't do anything to this teacher. Yoner saw that the teacher's purpose was to deal with situations, not to find herbs, so he held up the herbs his group had found and asked the professor if he really didn't need them. She would really regret it if the professor said there was no need to use it because her group had gone through a lot of trouble to get it, so she immediately called the professor out to see what the three of them had found. When the professor saw that it was the herb he was looking for, his eyes widened in surprise. He didn't think they could find it. Then he happily ran out and hugged the group of three, solemnly announcing that they had passed the subject and saying they were talented students here to study this subject. The professor smiled cunningly and whispered to Li Han that, as he expected, he would have to study this subject, making his face as black as the bottom of a pot. Li Han was so desperate that tears came to his eyes that he thought his life was over. After a while of being immersed in misery, he finally accepted reality. With a listless face and lifeless eyes, he forced a smile and said to Professor Uregilm, I will try my best. Alchemy is a subject. In my dream, hearing you say that, he looked at you happily. His eyes looked at him with satisfaction in his mind. This boy seemed very mature. Kids this age were often rebellious, but this boy was not. The professor told me, because you defeated the wild boar and collected a little bit of weed, I will give you a privilege. I heard that, wondering, a privilege. Hearing his question, he excitedly answered, I have a hut in the forest. You have the privilege of going there whenever you want this school year. When he heard that, he was startled and asked again, what? He also wondered, are you going to ask me to volunteer to clean up? As if he knew what you were thinking, he cleared his throat. Ahem, let me explain more to you. I looked towards him quite expectantly. Suddenly the professor asked the three of us, what do you think students need the most? Hearing that question, Yoner standing next to him answered, snacks. Seeing that answer, he was dissatisfied and said, "Now your life here is quite chaotic and in just a week it will be completely chaotic." Hearing what the professor said made him restless. "Chief." In his mind, he envisioned the menu he would eat as mushroom rice and bread and exclaimed, "That's right, who can stand this kind of limited menu?" He continued to think and remember one thing, and everyone in his tower was of royal origin. While you were thinking, the professor was still chattering, and my hut was full of fresh ingredients. He said it with great pride, not to mention the fresh fruits and vegetables I picked myself. He sounded like he realized something, so that means. A cupboard full of food appeared before his eyes. He happily thought, "Is this a true buffet?" His eyes lit up and he grabbed his hand. "Alchemy is really good, Professor." He seemed to have found an ally. "Oh ho ho, this clever guy, I understand what you mean, right?" Everyone had finished beating the wild boar that Professor Urigum released. It was very big. Some people saw that and asked, "What a crazy professor, did he release the wild boar and force us to deal with it? Does that sound right?" Some people followed suit. "I will never study this subject again." Some people exclaimed, "I even thought I was done." He saw them talking and turned pale and went the other way. I was about to complain about what a strange school this was, but nothing surprised me anymore. Then he regained his composure. His priority now was. In front of him now was a wooden house. Next to it there is also a small stream gurgling continuously. Standing in front of the first house, he just thought, make sure to have food rations. The three of us started standing around the wild boar and started to deal with it. After a while, he tiredly wiped the sweat from his forehead and sighed. He looked at the wild boar lying on the ground and thought to himself, "I learned how to handle animals for food from Alrarlong, but doing it alone is a lot of work." While he was thinking about how to handle this pig, Yoner took the initiative to come over. "Lihan." Yoner looked at you with a worried face, his eyebrows furrowed and his voice trembled. "Let me help you." Seeing that Yoner's expression was not very good, he asked. He didn't look very well. "Are he okay?" Although a bit scared, she still tried to forcefully reply, "Of course it's fine, but can you share some meat with me?" Nelia heard the two talk and also stood up. Turning towards him and Yoner, they asked loudly, "Are you really going to kill it?" Nelia continued in disbelief, "You guys are all nobles, you don't know how to do it." He heard Nelia say that and immediately called her name, Nelia. Just calling her name made her scared. He and Yoner showed a different side than usual and asked Nelia, "Do you hate meat?" Hearing that, Nelia looked at the two in shock. Nelia's thoughtful eyes revealed a contemplative look. Then walked over to where you were and Nelia told you to, "Let me show you my skills as a hunter." Looking at the two people, Nelia and Yoner, he silently assessed that Nelia was really good at this job, while Yoner came from a family that was very familiar with handling materials, so he was pretty sure that with these two friends, things would go smoothly. Right after that, Professor Urigum brought a large bag and told him, "Here are some tools." Seeing that bag, he quickly said, "Thank you, Professor." The wild boar was placed neatly on a large towel. The three of us each took a tool to share to deal with the wild boar. He told the other two, "Now let's begin." Suddenly Nelia noticed something. Nelia looked at him and silently assessed. He was better than I thought. Not only that, Nelia also asked himself, do they teach things like this in Wardanas's house? Now that everyone has divided the wild boar into parts, Yoner said, "We will now skin it, cut the meat into pieces and hang them on each piece, doing it very precisely." He continued, "You should not remove the intestines, because they can be used to make sausages," saying that those intestines were used by him to make sausages. He held the fan and sat fanning his face, no longer bright at all, thinking, I don't know how much longer this hellish life will last, maybe I should reserve this for later. Professor Urigum, when he saw the large slabs of meat being hung high for smoking, laughed happily. "Oh ho, you guys are going to make bacon, that's impressive." He seriously told the three people, no matter how good the weather is, the meat will spoil easily, smoking is the right choice. Hearing his recognition, he immediately politely said, "Thank you, Professor, for your compliment." My heart also felt a little happier. Professor Urigum was quite impressed that the boy had only been learning alchemy for 3 days and could, to get to this point, but to smoke meat proficiently like this. Professor Urigum continued to think with satisfaction. The boy exceeded his expectations. Suddenly, his stomach made some gurgling sounds, causing everyone to pay attention, and he was also startled. Hearing his recognition, he immediately politely said, "Thank you, Professor, for your compliment." My heart also felt a little happier. Professor Urigum was quite impressed that the boy had only been studying alchemy for 3 days and could still do it, to get to this point, but to smoke meat proficiently like this. Not letting everyone wait too long, he immediately started preparing the dish. He added a little seasoning to taste. Seeing him like that, the professor was not inferior and brought out a bag of food, surprising Yoner, leaving him with sparkling eyes. When he gave it to him, he began to prepare it and he looked at him in confusion. After a while, he had set up a table of extremely delicious food. Just looking at it made his stomach growl. He told everyone, "Let's eat." On the table there were also special spices from Urium jam. He happily sandwiched a large piece of meat into 2 halves of bread. Yoner and Nelia next to him also began to enjoy their meals with extremely satisfied faces. While eating, Yoner exclaimed to the professor, "His jam is super delicious." Hearing his praise, he couldn't close his mouth and smiled. He proudly said, "Just eat as much as you can while you can, not always, enjoy like this." Then he brought out a plate of meat that looked so delicious, the professor who was eating it had to speak up, even though he didn't know what magic he had cast on the meat, its taste was truly divine. The 4 people eating and drinking together under the canopy of green trees nearby also found themselves immersed in nature. Happiness is simply like that. After finishing eating, I prepared 3 or 4 small bags to store food. Yoner came and sat next to him and asked him, "Bacon is fine, but what should you do about unprocessed meat?" Hearing that, he replied, "I'm too full so I can't eat anymore." He and Yoner looked at the bacon in front of them and could only sigh. Nelia sitting at the table saw this and asked the 2 of us, "How about sharing it with our friends at the tower?" Since there was a way to deal with all this bacon, the 2 immediately exchanged looks. The 2 of them turned around at the same time. He looked at Nelia with a cheerful expression. "Do you mean we should sell meat?" Yoner chimed in next to him. "What a great idea." Nelia looked at the 2 of them in bewilderment, or asked again, when did I say that?" He started discussing with Yoner, "All the students at Tan Long Tower are rich. It shouldn't be a problem." She immediately replied, "Yeah, they are all royalty so they don't want alms." Nelia listened to the other 2 and made her head dizzy. After a while of discussing, they decided to sell all this meat. Nelia looked at the 2 people and wondered, "Are all royals like this?" He started to discuss with Yoner, "All the students at Tan Long Tower are rich. It shouldn't be a problem." She immediately replied, "Yeah, they are all royalty so they don't want alms." Nelia listened to the other 2 and made her head dizzy. Nelia put her hands on the table and asked again, "Are you guys really going to sell meat for money?" Hearing Nelia ask that, he immediately asked, "Do you want to join?" Nelia straightly refused. "No way, I just want to share with my friend." Nelia was scared and hugged her meat bag tightly. "You laughed when you saw that. It's up to you, but you'll regret it." Yoner also contributed, "He's right. Friendship is temporary and the economic situation is forever." Nelia retorted inaudibly, "Both of you shut up." After eating and drinking, the professor sat there watching the other 3 people laugh and floss their teeth. Looking at the 3 of them, he couldn't help but admire. All 3 of them were talented and enthusiastic, but they also looked like they were potentially destructive. He sat down under a tree and leaned back, looking at the sky. Looking at the tower in the distance, I thought to myself, I'm pretty sure there will be a future headache. Returning to the Tan Dragon Tower, this tower was built far from the main tower and always welcomed students with the scent of young leaves, but today is a bit unusual. A strange scent wafted into a student's sense of smell. Faced with this irresistible scent, he couldn't help but feel strange and wondered what this smell was. It turned out that the scent was coming from a steak that was being grilled and looked very delicious. In the distance, a student wearing an apron is demonstrating his steak-making skills. Walking towards the scent, he saw Li Han and Yoner grilling meat. He happily greeted and asked everyone if they hadn't eaten anything yet. Witnessing this, the entire group of students were stunned. A male student pointed at the 2 of them and asked what they were both doing, not to mention. Li Han looked towards the group of students and said that he and Yoner had prepared for everyone, come and sit down to eat. At that suggestion, the group of students looked happy like they were celebrating, really. Hearing that he was about to eat meat to his heart's content, everyone's face couldn't help but feel hungry, but suddenly Li Han added. Li Han smiled and gently raised a finger and said that if he wanted to eat, each person would give him 1 silver coin. Each piece of meat gradually melted in their mouths. They ate and cried with joy, not remembering how long it had been since they had eaten meat and did not think they would receive such a wonderful gift. Seeing that the price was so reasonable and also being able to eat the most delicious seafood, the group of students couldn't stop praising it. However, people did not expect that Li Han and Yoner sold meat for 3 times the price outside, nor did Li Han think that their business would progress so well. The faces of the 2 of them immediately turned cunning. They thought it was reasonable to do so because no one could buy meat here, just buy and sell. At this time, Guy Nandu emerged from his head, his whole body limp, his hand holding his hungry stomach, constantly complaining about how noisy it was outside. Seeing the delicious plates of steak before his eyes was like seeing heaven. He suddenly blurted out, "What is this, huh?" Li Han turned around and saw him standing there and said there he was, Guy Nandu. Then Li Han invited Guy Nandu to eat with him. He was both happy and didn't think he could eat with him. A once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Guy Nandu did not politely thank him and sat down, happily preparing to eat. At this moment, Li Han suddenly grabbed his hand and stopped him. Nothing in this world is free. Guy Nandu is no exception. Li Han held out his hand and asked him to pay 1 coin before eating. When Guy Nandu was asked for money, it was difficult for him to understand why Li Han collected the money. He explained to him that a noble's honor does not allow him to use free things, but he had no money left in him at this time due to the law, chief. Seeing that he kept hesitating but not wanting to make things difficult for him, Li Han said it wasn't a problem. Then, he came up with another plan. A debit note was brought in front of Guy Nandu. He just needed to write down the amount he had eaten and sign here. Seeing that he was about to get a delicious meal without spending a dime, Guy Nandu trembled with emotion and whispered Li Han's name. His hands were shaking as he held the pen tightly, unable to help but be moved by Li Han's decision. The next second, Guy Nandu signed the paper while sobbing like a baby and complimented Li Han on why he was such a wonderful man. Even though I was caught in the crosshairs, Guy Nandu still felt extremely grateful for what Li Han did for him and secretly regretted that he had broken off his friendship with Li Han before. I really have an eye for people. Only then did he understand that this was true friendship. Li Han and Yoner standing in a corner couldn't help but secretly rejoice, and so today everyone was happy. Returning to the magic castle on a new day, the students prepared to start class. A student held a thick book and wondered if today's lesson would be about the basic properties of magic. The other students also sighed in frustration, wondering why they were nobles and had to attend classes like this, and what the teachers thought of them. A female student thought they were already perfect. Why did they have to learn those things? Li Han stood to the side listening to such strong words and laughed and felt shocked when he heard that. The students entered the classroom and gradually settled into their seats for the lesson to begin. Li Han, Guy Nandu and Yoner decided to sit together. As soon as they sat down on the chair, they heard the Skull Headmaster's good morning call. A blue smoke surrounded Li Han. He heard the familiar voice just now speak and immediately looked up in that direction. Don't tell him. The lesson began with the principal's introduction to the iron-headed students. He greeted and introduced that he would be the professor responsible for teaching the nature of magic. It was true that nothing could escape his eyes. Just one glance at the students' vibrant energy and the principal knew that they had just eaten something. The students had not yet had anything to eat. This was contrary to what the principal predicted. He thought it would take a month for them to find food. Then a blue-haired student heard such strange thoughts and immediately asked the principal if they had to survive to find food. He stubbornly refused to listen to the idea of going out to earn his own food, but after a short while of insurrection, he didn't want to say those nonsense anymore, so he used magic to block the student's throat. Then the principal looked down at the still confused students and praised them for learning so quickly, which also made him very happy. On the outside, he was so happy, but in his heart he was constantly worried about those iron heads. He noticed that every year the students enrolling, but the students from Thanglong Tower were always the slowest. The best is Wianvu Tower, followed by Bakho. The two best names appear in his mind. The principal realized that the reason why the students from Thanglong Tower were always the slowest was because the students there were all high-ranking nobles but had never done difficult things, so they always adapted the slowest. The principal took a look and then evaluated them to be able to reach this level. Very cool. And a certain student caught his eye and was considered the focus by the principal. In this game, it was obvious that the person he thought would lead this year was none other than Li Han. Face to face with the principal, Li Han told himself not to make eye contact with him, and the principal knew at first sight that Li Han was a different student. Looking at him, the principal did not expect there to be someone this free from that harsh family. And as for the principal, he also believes that a free mind is the essence of a magician, and pushes his students to the limit for that reason. The blue-haired student from earlier was no longer stubborn and immediately cooperated with the principal to make the class go smoothly. He asked the principal what was important in this class. The principal also saw that it was a good question and immediately asked him for his opinion, but he wasn't sure so he didn't answer yet. A blue smoke emitted. He slowly answered, that is. He was gentle just a second ago but now suddenly angry, pointing at the students and screaming because he was scolded by the emperor when a graduate student from the academy went out to cause trouble. Hearing the principal burst out like that, the hair on the back of the neck of the students listening stood up in fear. He asked the students if they knew how much trouble their senior had caused. The principal recalled without anger. Because he was scolded countless times, he used these ironheads as a front to prove that he was a good teacher. He said that this lesson was just an excuse so that when their seniors became trash, there is also no penalty. After a while of enthusiastically explaining, he couldn't have been more detailed. He put his face close to the student and asked if he understood, and the student hesitantly replied. The principal continued to lecture. He said that magicians were capricious people. The student should not argue that they were not, because that would only make him more angry. After a while of chattering, the principal asked the students to open their books and read the first page. Who would have thought that the magic class would turn into a reading class, with all the students shouting in unison, "I won't cause trouble with magic." Still not satisfied with the principal's response, he asked to read more loudly. The students below also reluctantly shouted loudly that I did not cause trouble with magic. Even Li Han was surprised by the principal's extremely unique teaching style that he had no words for this. From inside the castle, the sound of students still shouting, "I won't cause trouble with magic." Li Han didn't know if this method really penetrated the students' minds or not. After shouting a few useless lines, not knowing if the students could hear any of them, the principal hoped that today's lecture would touch their hearts, and next he needed 2 teaching assistants for the lesson. Hearing that, the students sitting below glanced back and forth to avoid it. Everyone remained silent and no one dared to speak up. Seeing everyone ignoring him, he knew this was a difficult task, but still. He saw that no one in the passive class was willing to accept it, so he immediately gave a warning that if no one volunteered, it would be more difficult. Li Han thought that this job would not be free but would have a reward, so he boldly raised his hand to volunteer to do it. Seeing that in the middle of a forest of cowardly ironheads, this student was so brave, the principal exclaimed in surprise. Then the principal put his face close to him, making Li Han startled, and said he also liked to stand out. Li Han had just been praised, but he also humbly said that he was honored to support the professor he respected. The principal thought the words he said were just like the wind and clouds, so he told him that he was no longer familiar with those empty words. After saying that, the principal turned around and said that opportunities only come to those who are ready to stand up and seize them. Li Han thought that perhaps he had discovered that he was doing it for his own benefit. Guy Nandu sitting next to him also thought why Li Han was so reckless and said, "Li Han, are you crazy?" He was now as green as a banana leaf, panicking and warning Li Han that who knew what that crazy principal would force him to do. But another student put his hand on his shoulder and reassured him that don't stop Li Han, Wardanas is not crazy, he died for us. Guy Nandu, still pale and sweating, asked again. He put his hands on his thighs and trembled, thinking that if that was the case, he should kill himself for the sake of justice, then immediately encouraged himself to move proactively. Guy Nandu kept urging himself to move and move his legs. He mustered all his courage and closed his eyes to volunteer. But Ashan was one step faster than Guy Nandu. He calmly stood up and raised his hand. Seeing another student volunteer, the principal recognized him as the stubborn name of the Dalkad family and that his family was always proficient in paperwork. Upon his recognition, Ashan politely thanked him. Li Han looked at the familiar figure and immediately remembered that it was Ashan. He wondered if he was also aiming for the same reward as him. Suddenly Ashan raised his hand to lift his glasses as if he meant something. It turned out that Ashan wanted to repay Li Han for saving him before. Li Han told Ashan that he did not need to go that far, but if he owed a favor, he must repay it. Ashan did not hesitate to say that the Dalkad family always did everything fairly. While they were loving each other, the principal appeared from behind and reminded him that he was happy to see the two of them close, but there was still work to do. He then put a bunch of safety rules in front of them and told them to look them over for the next lecture. Human power is limited, not cattle, but he asked both of them to copy it out by hand equal to the number of students here. Dusk had fallen, and both of them were still so busy copying that their hands were tired and their mouths were constantly complaining. Seeing that he was being exploited like that, Ashan couldn't believe it. He was angry and his whole body was on fire. He felt like it was a waste of time for the principal to make them do this unnecessary work when he could have just winked and finished. Seeing that Ashan's situation didn't look too good, Li Han was worried about whether he would faint. With a domineering personality like the principal, Li Han also understood the principal's intentions. He was sure he thought that relying on magic would make the students crazy. The principal didn't even let them use the most basic magic of glowing, so what was the meaning of writing magic? He was probably trying to challenge both of them. Li Han thought he was a dedicated teacher, so there was probably some hint here. Then he went to the podium to look for clues to solve this tiring job. Seeing that, Ashan immediately asked him what he was doing. Li Han then went around investigating and explained that there might be something useful here, so he was looking for suggestions to resolve the situation. Ashan was also hesitant about whether it was okay or not. He thought that this was the principal's lecture hall. There was no rule saying it couldn't be, so there was definitely something hidden here. All this time, sitting in one place struggling with a bunch of rules, Ashan has now figured out something. After Ashan was cleared, his eyes immediately sharpened and said that it was okay to steal a little from time to time, so let's split up and find it quickly. While rummaging around the room, Ashan couldn't find any notes, neither did Li Han, and he suggested looking from another angle. Suddenly La Han's eyes bumped into something that caught his attention. It was a drawer surrounded by magic, perhaps containing something inside that he needed. He found a new discovery and waved to Ashan to come closer. Really, he also happily ran over. Both of them stood in front of this mysterious drawer and hesitated, not knowing what to do. This, Ashan said slowly. Then he asked to open the drawer. They put their hands on the handle and pulled it out. Screaming at the swallow, they thought they had found something useful, but in the end the principal with a green skull appeared to their surprise. Li Han stood still and wondered if this was an illusion magic. Before he could think too much, the principal spoke up and said that opening the drawers meant that they had stopped doing meaningless things and started using their brains to think. Then he didn't forget to add a few sarcastic comments that he hoped it would go crazy faster and that they looked pathetic for working so long. After teasing the foolish students, the principal began to introduce elementary manipulation, telling them it was best to learn quickly. After a while, the warden said so, then said goodbye and disappeared into thin air. What just happened left Ashan with a huge anger. He realized that the old principal really had something in mind. Ashan saw that it was useless to put in this stupid method, so he angrily scolded him. He didn't understand anything. Why did he have to teach like this? He couldn't stand the oppression and immediately invited Li Han to join him in protesting and said that if they went together, even the principal would. Seeing him attentive to the elementary manipulation, Ashan also stopped. Ashan immediately became speechless, thinking Li Han was a traitor, but Li Han calmly apologized because he couldn't resist. In order for Ashan to accept his fate, Li Han explained that if he thought about it, what could Ashan do if he complained to the crazy principal? That's Einrogard's rule, about 95% fail, but Li Han was surprised when Ashan thought there was up to 5% success. To avoid being laughed at by the principal, let's practice. For elementary control, thoughts, chants, and seals are important in spell casting, and the chant is to move, control. Both picked up their wands and enthusiastically practiced. Ashan held his wand and pointed at the feather, but even though he braced himself and glared with all his might, it still did not move. After he ran out of mana and sat on the ground in despair, Li Han comforted him, telling him to rest a bit. Li Han also knows that magic is really not easy. It looks simple, but the magical energy gathered is different every time. Next, Li Han practiced in a new way. He balanced on the wheel like a circus monkey. He told himself to concentrate highly. He thought it felt like this and then lowered both legs. Li Han remembers the days when he was pressed by a deadline and focused on the feeling like it was his last chance, like there was only 1 minute left before the mission ended. Li Han wanted it to be as straight as bamboo but as light as a feather. His hand held his wand and held it forward, concentrating as much as he could. Then Li Han ordered the feather pen below to move. As soon as he received his command, a thread of magic was inserted into the pen and lit up. Very soon the pen moved back and forth. Li Han was so successful in making the feather pen fly that even Ashan was surprised and exclaimed that it was flying. Ashan saw that Li Han did it without much effort and was extremely admirable. It was true that the Wardanas family was different. Li Han had a happy face, now he just needed to slowly move it to the paper. Around the pen emitted light of magic, it moved slightly in the air. Then suddenly it flew past his eyes. Then it crashed out the window and shattered the glass. He and Ashan turned around and froze in place. Before Li Han could understand what was happening, the pen was pinned to the apple tree trunk. Ashan asked Li Han what he did. Did he shoot it out like a porcupine quill? Li Han also thought that must be the case. He held it in his hand and read the elementary manipulation spell again and found that the spell's text had 2 difficult points. The first is that after casting spells non-stop, you need to continuously focus and control the object. However, after completing that extremely difficult chanting part, the control part is equally difficult. After reading it again thoroughly, Li Han decided to pick up his wand and try again. He gradually poured magic into the feather pen slowly as possible, and reassured himself that there was no need to rush. While the situation was tense, the principal's face appeared from nowhere and asked if you guys had done it. Very happy, he wrote the rest with his magic. His sudden appearance made his heart skip a beat, and the feather pen also went out of his control. After that, the pen was frantically thrown everywhere, leaving him with no time to react. When the principal was hoping that they would feel his kindness, it did not let go of the principal, but after a while, without control, it also stabbed him in the forehead, making him cry out and die. It was true that his screams were heard from inside the building. Seeing that they had caused a big problem and were about to die, both of their faces turned pale in fear. The principal was displeased and scolded the student for daring to aim at the principal and snipe like that. Faced with such a difficult situation, Ashan could still see that Li Han was cool, but Li Han immediately told him to shut up, you crazy person. Before the feather pen could land on his forehead, magic stopped it and turned it into ash. Standing in front of this amazing performance, he exclaimed and praised him for grasping magic faster than he thought, and even had to admit that Li Han was better than he looked. Li Han wondered if that was all. It seemed like he was quite happy. Then, taking that opportunity, Li Han quickly asked the respected principal for tips on how to control it better. The principal wondered if Li Han could chant the spell but couldn't control it. He also agreed, seeing that the two of them had things to discuss and he hadn't been able to do anything. Ashan found Li Han really impressive. The principal reassured him that he was only in his first year and that it was fine, no need to try too hard. After hearing that, Li Han breathed a sigh of relief because he always thought it was due to magical energy, but it wasn't. But who would have thought that Li Han would be disappointed? The next second he lied and said that the chanting part was difficult, but the control part needed a little practice. He remembered the moment the pen flew like that guy and said that Li Han was an unusual person, so he could do that, but only he could find a way. After listening to the lecture for a while, Li Han understood and happily thanked the principal. Li Han bowed his head and said he would try harder, but he found him too boring and not fun at all. Looking at Ashan's clear reactions, the principal saw that this kid had an impressive expression. He said he would tame it better, so there was nothing to worry about, so the principal finished speaking and continued to perform magic. Seeing that there was nothing left to play here, he immediately used magic to take Li Han to the cafeteria and said it was time for lunch. Seeing that in just a split second he had gone from the lecture hall to the dining room, he was also so scared. Was it teleportation magic? Not long after, he landed on the ground as fast as the wind. Li Han stood up, brushed the dust off his clothes and acknowledged that the principal never did anything unnecessary, but instead used time and space magic to take him to the cafeteria. There's trouble again. You're in the cafeteria, so where has Ashan been transferred to by him? While you were wondering, Ashan was transferred to the infirmary to recover his energy. Entering the cafeteria, it was as empty as a pagoda with no one in sight. He guessed that it was probably past lunchtime, so there was no one there. Today it's still the same dishes, 2 rice balls and a loaf of bread neatly arranged on a plate. But he felt it was okay because Li Han still had the bacon from before. While he was busy at the dining table, a figure appeared from afar. It was none other than Adenart. God avoided the meal, but the princess went to look for him and later met Li Han in the cafeteria. He was also surprised to see someone coming to find him at this hour. Is it a princess? Li Han paused his meal and asked the princess if he needed anything. Adenart reached into his shirt and took out something. The princess gently brought the scroll to him and said these were the documents he asked for last time. It turned out that the princess still remembered the list she had asked for. Li Han was secretly happy and shyly thanked the princess. As soon as Li Han opened the scroll, he saw something was wrong. Inside is a list of popular lectures. These are subjects that are not easy to get points but are popular, such as Basic Alchemy Overview, Basic Linguistics, Martial Arts and Basic Humanities. Reading the first line, he couldn't help but wonder if alchemy was a popular subject in general, but it was good nonetheless. But Adenart misunderstood what he meant. What he wanted were lists that were easy to earn points, but the popular subjects he was holding were not. The princess also did not understand what Li Han needed those things, so she asked him again about his intentions. Then he directly explained in detail to Adenart to understand what he meant. A popular subject with many participants makes it difficult to earn points, while an unpopular subject is the opposite. After hearing this, the princess's face was also confused. Gradually, Adenart also realized what he meant. Adenart wondered if Li Han was looking for easy subjects to learn when he was a child of the Wardanas family. Adenart also began to doubt his eye for people because he thought he was just like other nobles, but it seemed completely different. Then he took a moment to put his hand in his shirt and rummage for something. Fortunately, while compiling that list, the princess also compiled a list of subjects to avoid. That's it. Seeing the list he wanted in front of him, Li Han couldn't help but be happy. He also saw the poverty and boredom that no one wanted to learn. The first is basic swordsmanship. Very few people go to magic school and learn swordsmanship. Next is basic magic fighting. Learning about keeping distance is also neglected by wise students who rarely fight. Not that knowing many survival methods would be good, but he didn't care about this. When he got the list, Li Han happily thanked the princess. There was nothing more to do, so the princess turned around and said, "Then I'm leaving." The next morning, Li Han walked leisurely and felt unfortunate because everyone refused. Knowing Li Han's plans, Gai Nandu suddenly asked him why he intended to participate in uncommon subjects. Nobles don't do that. Even so, Yeoner apologized to him and politely refused, telling Li Han that she already had a class at that time. Ashan also did not support Li Han and questioned why he participated in those trash subjects. In the face of detractors, Li Han remained calm because he was sure they didn't know what was about to happen to them. Basically, the concept of considering students does not exist in any school. They know that there are students participating in their subjects but do not care much. So to focus on the subject someone likes, you need other subjects where you don't need to do unnecessary things. That is an appropriate choice and redistributes focus. Thinking so much, in the end Li Han did not choose to think too much, anyway. What he didn't expect was that the basic distance-keeping magic fighting class was located in the basement. Looking down, he saw a few simple but foreboding stairs. There is a saying that all citizens must know: never think of entering a mage's tower. Even though it looked normal on the outside, there were two brothers who survived the tower for a week, but there were also people who were trapped forever. Reading this, Li Han immediately asked if this fairy tale was a bit exaggerated. Then Mr. Al-Rarlong immediately said it was a bit. Suddenly he exclaimed that it was a fairy tale because in reality the people trapped in the tower would go to visit their grandparents, so escape was impossible. Li Han's smiling face suddenly turned gray because of what he heard. And the Einrogard Tower is an example of a magic tower. For that reason, very few first-year students dare to explore the Academy Tower. He reassured himself that this was just an academy, so it was probably okay. Nothing had happened to him on the first floor of the tower or the dormitory. Before he could finish comforting himself, Principal Lich behind him asked him if he wanted to go to the first floor. Making him startled, his heart wanted to jump out as he asked why the principal was here. He suddenly thought that meeting him here was a good opportunity. So he changed his face and told his beloved principal that it was nice to meet him. Li Han said he was about to go down to the first floor, so he wanted the teacher to impart a little lecture, causing the principal to gasp in surprise. The principal started teasing him and said he would teach him, but then he changed his tone and said he would bring him a flower if he saw his body tomorrow. Inside, he was angry and silently scolded him for being a hateful old man, but he still had to smile wryly. An entity that could laugh with absolutely no malice or resentment from within could only be a graduate student. The entire dark basement was lit by flaming torches. He calmly went deeper inside but found that it was normal, unlike what the principal threatened him with. When standing in front of a door, he kept feeling a bad feeling, but still tried to reassure himself. Suddenly a student passed by, catching his attention. When the two of them saw someone coming, they discussed excitedly. The girl exclaimed when she learned that someone also chose to take this class. Li Han secretly thought with pride that the school had so many students. How could he be the only one in this class, when his friend suddenly discovered something was not quite right? Seeing that the name sign was a basic magic fighting class to keep their distance, they quickly ran away because they had both come to the wrong class. Luckily, they checked again, leaving only Li Han standing there confused. They told each other to go home quickly, but they couldn't help but be surprised that someone would study this subject because it had scared many people away because of its difficulty. Li Han saw this scene and stood in front of the door somewhat confused. Now he was in a dilemma. In the end, he still chose to walk in and saw that there were exactly 3 students in the class. The pink-haired girl looked at him like an alien. The other 2 boys looked confused and looked at each other. Looking at their expressions, he could guess that they thought he didn't know what class this was, so he came here. He continued walking to his seat, and when he saw the orbs, he was a bit confused as to what they were used for. At this time, someone was already sitting in the corner reminding everyone that it was time to take their seats, making him startled. When he turned around, there was someone sitting there and the students in the class were completely unaware of this presence and were now whispering. It was a person with pale skin, melancholy eyes and long fangs, making Li Han somewhat suspicious as to whether he was a vampire. After settling down in class, the teacher introduced himself as Vodali Bagrak and would be the one in charge of basic magic fighting, keeping this distance. He held the ball and said he hoped everyone would help. Then introduced it as a crystal made from spirit stone, which is a stone compatible with magical energy. When the stars are at a certain time, they will radiate a divine energy. The spirit stone is the material created from the process of absorbing that energy. Then the teacher asked the students to stand up and transfer energy into that sphere. He also stood up and did the same. When he touched the sphere, he wondered if he could do it. He once failed basic spells like lighting. As soon as he and his friends touched it, the ball was already floating, making everyone surprised. This made him a bit incredulous at how easy it was. Could it be that it wasn't a normal spirit star stone? He speculated that they were actually antiques. At first glance, he was pretty sure the professor had created them. Li Han remembered hearing that antiques were very expensive, but the girl behind him seemed to be having difficulty controlling the ball, making it suddenly soar high. She worriedly reminded everyone to be careful because it would break the ceiling. But suddenly the ball stopped. At this point, the professor spoke up and explained that the orb was connected to their will so they could control it, but he had placed a few restrictions so they wouldn't destroy the lecture hall. The pink-haired girl breathed a sigh of relief. She was lucky, otherwise she would have been lost. But before she finished speaking, the ball flew back and hit her straight, making her scream in pain. The teacher gently reminded them that those limitations did not exist in their place. The professor also carefully reminded them not to break the bridge, but her friend felt that she was the one who broke it first, not it. After that, the teacher ignored his friend and told everyone to continue letting the ball float, making him feel that this professor seemed a bit strange. The difficulty is increased when the teacher asked them to draw a circle. Li Han felt that even though it was an antique, it was still too difficult to do this because it didn't move the way he wanted. Suddenly a boy in class shouted happily and said he had drawn a circle. But the professor just coldly asked him to do it again. Hearing what the teacher said, he didn't think much and immediately agreed. Li Han seemed confused as to whether this was all he would do in this class. He saw that the teacher kept making the same request, telling them how long it would take them to draw a circle. But he just calmly replied that they needed to continue until they drew a complete circle. When the two boys heard that, their faces turned pale, so they made up an excuse to go to the bathroom to escape, but the teacher said that permission was not needed. So they tiptoed away from this place. The pink-haired girl saw them leaving and looked a little shaken. She looked at them and asked for help, wanting them to take her with them. Then her eyes began to become weak and lose sight, her face turned pale. She collapsed on the table and fainted, so they had a reasonable reason to take her with them because she couldn't study anymore. Li Han admired her friend's ability to play the role. He approached her, shook her a few times to see how her health was. The poor student's face wrinkled in discomfort. It seemed like she was exhausted from running out of mana. That fainting wasn't an act. It turned out Li Han thought wrong for her. He helped her stand up and asked the professor for permission to leave because she had used up all her mana. Before asking for permission, the professor just coldly told him to continue drawing circles when he recovered. Meeting such a difficult professor, he was speechless and thought he was the only one left to listen. After taking the purple-haired student to rest, Li Han returned to class and continued to practice drawing circles. While the professor was sitting reading a book, he asked him about the grading policy for this assignment. After that, the professor closed the book and told him to follow the rules. Points were graded according to rank and starting with the highest position depending on the number of students in the class. After listening to the explanation, Li Han also understood and had a certain grasp. At this moment, happiness was welling up in his heart as he did not expect that the way to earn points would be so easy. This class was truly a jackpot. For you, this is as easy as pie. Just stay until the end and you will get a high score for this test. This is truly an ideal class to give him what he has been looking for so long, like a jar of sweet honey for him to taste. Just drawing 3 simple circles, repeating this over and over again would bring high scores to Li Han. He would be very willing. Observing Li Han practicing so diligently, the professor also stood aside in contemplation. He thought about this simple, repetitive task, but he did it willingly. Thinking it's easy, every year the number of students participating in this class is like a wave. But after that they all ran back and forth, they receded as fast as the tide. So much so that last year the registration list was empty and the class didn't have any students. But as a professor, Volody doesn't care and still goes to the lecture hall and teaches lectures every year because the contract with the principal is not to admit a lot of students. Without any students to teach, the professor could only sit alone in the empty classroom and then quietly leave. Back to reality, anyway, things are different now. A student appeared and broke the professor's silence. That was Li Han. A mature, bright boy, everything from his behavior to his intonation showed that he came from a prestigious family. Vodali didn't know about Li Han's abilities, but it wasn't difficult to recognize that he was special. The professor hoped that Li Han could stay here if so. The professor will have real students and this will be the first time he will be taught the next chapter. It was break time in the break room. The students were gathering together and chatting loudly. Li Han was now sitting on a chair, holding a glass of water and telling his friends around him to listen to him say something very important. After that, he happily bragged about the class where he didn't work but still ate and got good grades just by sitting, then told the other students not to miss such a good opportunity. Seeing Li Han introduce a real virtual listening class, Yoner was also confused, and Guy Nandu wanted to know more details about that subject. Li Han enthusiastically explained, just let the mana flow into the spirit stone and draw a circle. As simple as it sounded, Guy Nandu asked what happened next. But Li Han happily said that was all he needed to do. Other than that, just drawing a circle like that is easier than eating candy. Guy Nandu and Yoner couldn't help but ask questions about this strange subject. Inside the reading room, both of them were full of doubts about whether the professor was a fraud or not, but Li Han calmly said it didn't matter. He thought the important thing was that he got a high score, and his own benefit was the only thing he saw in front of him. Faced with the mindset that successful people always have their own path, they see that Li Han is truly a different person. Knowing that he had no right to say that, Yoner also saw that Li Han was a person who did not hesitate to use tricks for his own benefit. Li Han found himself trying his best to convince them, but they still didn't react, so he decided to eat this delicious piece of cake alone and said goodbye. Before Li Han could step out of the room, they were curious and wanted to know what that class was. When they both heard the name of the basic swordsmanship class, they were extremely shocked. Without any further hesitation, he walked to the place where the class was taking place. Li Han was standing in the courtyard in front of the southern main building, wondering if this place would be a training ground for basic swordsmanship. When he entered the training ground, he couldn't help but be surprised because the participants inside were as crowded as ants. But they were all students of the White Tiger Tower, which was new because they mainly came from a family of knights who were very good at swordsmanship and also very serious. But thinking about it, it was okay because fighting magic was his advantage. He would quickly learn swordsmanship as well. When other students saw Li Han coming from Tan Dragon Tower, they also started whispering. Moreover, those students also knew that he was from the Wardanas family, and even guessed that Li Han was here because he had learned something from their tutor and thought that he looked down on swordsmanship too much. Li Han knew they were very proud of their swordsmanship abilities, but now that he saw it with his own eyes, he realized that they were more aggressive than he thought. But who is afraid? He's not afraid. Li Han thinks it's not important, at most it's just teenagers. At this moment, among them, a big blue guy walked up to him majestically. It was none other than Durgyu. He then asked Li Han about his Wardanas family background from Tan Long. Everyone said that he was an elf, but then Li Han did not hesitate and calmly stood in front of him. He then despised Li Han for not being suitable for this serious sword class and reminded him that this was not a lecture from the beginning. Of course Li Han understood and thanked him, but Gyu saw that he was stubborn and didn't want to understand, so he said this wasn't swinging a sword like nobles do. And Li Han can absolutely get injured during the match because the students here will not hold back. Faced with that threat, Li Han brushed it off and told him firmly that he wouldn't hurt Gyu too much. Seeing that he was not afraid of threatening Li Han but also refuting him like that, he couldn't help but be confused. He was left with a huge anger by Li Han. Gyu's face was red with anger, which was enough to understand that a fight was about to happen. But before they could witness the eye-catching fight, a cough suddenly stopped them. That person continued to call for them to gather. Everything stopped here. Li Han heard the call and turned around to look and was startled. He looked into those eyes, so gentle but also full of severity. On that person's face there was a long scar across the eye. That person's legs were made of iron but still stood firmly on the ground. Next was his introduction to the students, where he introduced himself as Professor Angeldal. and he will be the one to teach them swordsmanship this time. Seeing that the professor is an elf, Li Han is also very interested. After that, the professor happily made sure that his students had all learned swordsmanship, but now everyone only came here to practice or keep them from being worn out over time. Then the professor offered to help the students hone their swordsmanship skills rather than teach them from the beginning, but he didn't know that Li Han was only there for the score. Suddenly, a small hand tapped his shoulder from behind. He turned to look, and it turned out that person was Jijel. Seeing Li Han turn around, she waved goodbye. Looking back and forth, Li Han wondered if this was another elf. This person immediately asked Li Han if he belonged to the Wardina's family. Seeing the other person ask that, Li Han immediately asked back to see what was going on. It's Lady Giselle, her. Lady Giselle did not answer. Li Han asked him why he belonged to a family famous for magic, so he studied swordsmanship. Li Han didn't beat around the bush, he just said that it was obvious. He raised his hand into a like button and said that because there were fewer people studying, the points would be easier to get. Lady Giselle immediately froze, surprised by Li Han's unique answer. Li Han felt that it would likely cause misunderstandings if he said another reason, but it would be easier to talk about the score issue. She nodded in agreement. He reached out to shake hands and introduced himself as Giselle of the Marathi family, and he could call her Marathi. Li Han looked at Giselle's hand and thought to himself that he was so young, but his hands were already calloused. Then he reached out to shake his hand and said it was nice to meet Marathi. He and Lady Giselle shook hands warmly. In his thoughts he wondered if this was the Marathi family. Li Han briefly thought about the Marathi family. This family was the family that guarded the harsh northern lands under harsh rules, and there, they used any means possible to achieve their goals. Get the purpose. That was Li Han's thoughts about the Marathi family. He looked at Lady Giselle and thought to himself that he looked completely different from the family's photo. Then Li Han dismissed that thought and said that rumors were not always true, and Li Han also thought that maybe he and Lady Giselle would become close in the future. The mysterious stone knife, also known as blue stone, is a great move learned from Arlalong, and as its name suggests, the mysterious stone knife is very tough. Because practicing it was quite difficult, the nobles avoided learning it, but Li Han endured the process. Why? He had no other choice. The professor asked Li Han one thing: could he use the mysterious stone blade? The professor spoke up and said that he also had roots and asked which family he belonged to. Amidst that question, the professor thought to himself that if Li Han used a mysterious stone blade, it must have come from. At this time, Li Han replied that he belonged to the Wardina's family, which made the professor very surprised. The professor asked again if that was the Wardina's family. The question seemed to seek certainty, and he also thought that his roots were so strong that he belonged to that family. He asked Li Han something. He wanted to know why he learned swordsmanship. Li Han did not hesitate to answer that he believed it was a necessary skill for a noble. The professor's face dropped and everything was exactly as he thought. Li Han saw that expression and was a bit stunned. Li Han looked at the expression and exclaimed that it was truly the typical expression of a professor. However, he is worried that if he says something wrong, his score will drop, and he also wants to know what the professor's answer is. Then Li Han replied to the professor that he also thought the same, but the more he studied, the more he understood the profoundness of the blade. Speaking of this, his eyes glowed with a bright light, full of confidence, and he said he couldn't stop himself from coming here. The excellent answer just now made him favorable in the professor's eyes. He did not hesitate to give him full marks. And when he saw Li Han's bewildered expression, the professor laughed out loud and answered nothing, and he was only embarrassed when he accidentally said out loud what he thought. Li Han also replied to the professor that he was very serious about this, and did not let his family background stop him from progressing. The professor also said that he performed better than some white students. Some tiger came here just to vase flowers. The professor pulled out his sword and he said that thanks to you, the student, he also learned something. This statement made Li Han's head full of questions. He brandished his sword in front of Li Han and said he would be serious with him. The professor urged him to quickly pick up his sword. Seeing the situation change so quickly, he immediately felt like something was wrong. And why did things turn out like that? Li Han was now tired and sat on the ground. He lay on the ground panting tiredly. The professor came over and talked about the mysterious stone blade being a great move as hard as rock. He reached out his hand to help him stand up and kept explaining that the mysterious stone blade never wavered, no matter who knew what happened, and that was the nature of the mysterious stone blade. The professor smiled and told Li Han to keep that in mind, and he also told Li Han that this was the end of practice. The professor turned around and called the next student up to spar with him. After Li Han sparred with the professor, his whole body was sore, so painful that it felt like he was being crushed. He wondered how many of the professor's moves he had received. Thinking back at this moment, the professor was really good at watching for his carelessness and opening up to reveal his weakness and then attacked. Li Han tiredly complained to the sky that he kept getting beaten. Very quickly, the previous student lost. The professor continued to call the next person. Li Han looked towards the professor and nodded, which was no joke. He kept looking at the professor and thought that all the students from the White Tiger Tower would become future knights, but the professor solved them too easily. As a swordsman, Arlalong is a rock that cannot be shaken. Engoldal is like flowing water, even though his arms and legs are fake. Li Han just sat there thinking. Engoldal told the other student that the sword was violent, so it needed to move more, and that the characteristics of the double sword were difficult but flexible, and finally, think before swinging the sword. He still enthusiastically teaches his students that when using the Mountain Moon sword, they need to be faster and sharper, not to be cautious and rush forward with everything they have. Through some of Engoldal's enthusiastic gestures, Li Han confirmed that he was truly an excellent professor, as he recognized students' perspectives and gave them direct advice.